a lot about the early Middle Ages. We've talked about the difficulty that they've encountered. We talked about the schism. We've talked about the Crusades now. We've talked about a number of things. What we haven't talked about is some of the good things that happened. So we're going to talk about some of those things and also some of the bad things, because this is, we're going to call it the Dark Ages for a reason. We're going to try to pull it all together by looking at a few different individuals. And we're going to see how this goes. So ask questions, keep coming with me. There's a lot of information. But it should give you kind of a feel for a lot of different personalities. We've already seen a number. We're going to see even more today. So what do we remember so far about, as we get towards, we're now in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, okay? What period generally comes next for the Renaissance, right? So this is the term of enlightenment. Where did that come from? We know that it's called the Renaissance, and they have some really cool paintings, but where did it come from? Why is it called the Renaissance? Rebirth. That's the definition. Where did it come from?
Science and knowledge and enlightenment.
Right. Where did that come from? Partly from the Muslims.
Kind of rediscovering ancient Greece and
So that's what happened. Where did that come from?
What was the Genesis? The Crusades? Like they're all traveling through Greece from the Crusades and they're rediscovering.
Good. Sort of.
I'm not sure what your guess is the monks.
You guys are doing great. That's partly where it came from. Where actually did it find it? It wasn't actually Greece. You don't discover Greek in Greece anymore. Where do you discover it? Cordoba, Spain. So when the Muslims came in, the Muslims of today are not necessarily the Muslims that we saw, right? So we talked about this with when Rick taught, was when they came in, they swept through, Muhammad and his followers swept through northern Africa all the way into Turkey. Sorry, I got to do the Rick thing where you have to reverse everything so you guys see it. Into Turkey, they swept through northern Africa and all the way, and they actually crossed the Gibraltar Strait and into Spain. And they took actually almost most of Spain, all the way up to Catalan and into the Pyrenees. And then Charlemagne comes and he pushes them back out, remember? And during the time that we're talking about, they continue to do that, because one of the things that happened was the caliphs in Spain were much more tolerant than the caliphs elsewhere in northern Africa and in the Middle East. And so they actually found a place for Jews to live, for Greeks to live, I'm calling that as a general term, where they brought with them some of their Greek literature. They brought some philosophy, they brought Jewish customs, they brought all kinds of stuff, and they lived in Spain, in Cordoba, and other places. There's a number of cities there where they lived in community, and their beliefs and practices kind of started merging with others, and they all became huge libraries, and it was actually quite peaceful and quite learned. As Rick said, Cordoba had miles of lighted streets. It was actually scientifically actually pretty advanced, and they lived with that for quite a while, until what happened was that what used to be a fairly unified movement all across the Muslim world started fracturing. Okay, and so when that fractured, it left Cordoba kind of by itself up here, and all these cities across North Africa and the Middle East, they all started kind of going after different, I don't remember the term, caliphs or whatever the term is. Okay, so that fractured the Muslim world. Now, what happened when that happened? What happens when that happens? Well, their solid base of trade and everything else goes out the window. It also opens them up to attack, because they're no longer unified and they can't call in reinforcements. So why did Europe all of a sudden start winning the battle? Well, because the Muslims were weakened. And so now all of a sudden the Franks and everybody else start pushing back into Spain, pushing the Muslims back out. And when they push the Muslims back out, they start taking the cities. And when they go into the cities, what do they find? Greek culture, Jewish culture. They find all those things that the Muslims had actually preserved, of all people. And so they started rediscovering Greek philosophy. Not in Greece, in Spain, of all places. Interesting, huh? Okay, so that tells you a little bit about the political structure. We also have France forming what we would actually recognize as France. We have Germany forming, but Germany's very different history in the Holy Roman Empire. It's complicated. I don't understand it all. I do know that it's going to continue this way for about 1,000 years until we go up to World War II or World War One, because they fractionalize and there's all kinds of different countries and nobles and everything else, and eventually you have World War One. Then you have a unified Germany. Then you have Nazi Germany, and then you have Western Germany, and then eventually you have Germany again. Theirs is a long history. France is much more simple. We also start having now the establishment of England as what we would call England, not necessarily just this fractured country that island, but we would actually start to discover this more as what we would call England. And what's more important is that all these kingdoms, England, France, Germany, Spain, they're starting to get established in the way that we understand them, but they're also becoming somewhat stable. We talked about Richard the Lionhearted. Remember, he was held for ransom for coins, currency. So political stability is allowing trade to grow, it's allowing coins to be minted, it's allowing some amount of stability against incursions. Now it's not just constantly turning over culture after culture, but these countries are actually, or these kingdoms, are strong enough to repel some of the invasions. So now it's actually some kind of stability again across Europe. The Crusades were opening trade, as we just talked about. The currency now was being minted, and you could actually go across kingdoms and trade currency, and that was okay. What else did that do? Think about that. If currency is now an accepted form of payment, what does that create? Okay, well, that's always been true. Banks and money lenders, and guess who dominated that industry? So if you don't like who's getting wealthy, who don't you like? Fast forward a couple 100,000 years. A guy named Adolf Hitler rises to power, and guess what he finds? All right. But right now we're in the thousands. Well before Adolf Hitler. So what else does it create, though? Before, what was wealth? Land. True. Trade. Good. So if before land was equal to wealth, now what has happened? Both of them are true. So it doesn't just switch. But that means that you don't have to own land to be wealthy. You can just have a lot of gold. And if you don't need land, where do you move? Into the cities. Yep. So now all of a sudden we start having the rise of city-states, right? Venice, some of these other places that will become significant here in a few hundred years, but this is where it's coming from. Now I can be rich and powerful without actually owning land. So now I have a growing bourgeoisie, a whole nother group of people that are getting rich without having to own land. Since land is a set amount, there was only a set amount of people that could be wealthy. Now that you can have money growth, how many people can get wealthy? Lots of people, right? You just had to figure out how to make more money. So what does it start to do? Well, now it becomes kind of like the 80s in the United States, where everybody was earning money. And all of a sudden, people start to see all this wealth growth and all this money growth, and they start to react to it. Okay? So now corruption is the kind of the term of the day. Before it was more dominance. Now people can see this growth of money and the desire to have more and more wealth. Not just land, but wealth. It's not dramatically different than before. I'm not saying anything's changed about human nature. How it's expressed has changed. Okay? The church is mainstream. We've already talked a lot about the Pope. We're going to talk about him a little bit more today. People were still largely uneducated, and the church we're going to see is less about the Bible. And now you're going to start seeing it really work out today. But there's some things that are still happening that are actually kind of interesting. All right, mendicant orders of monasticism. So we said that everybody is getting wealthy, which means greed is in the forefront. So what do you do if you're the church? What position do you adopt? Because remember, history is a series of actions and reactions. So what is a reaction to seeing everybody start to get really wealthy and greedy? You start saying that that wealth is bad and poverty is good. Is that true? Of course not, but that's your reaction. You always have to go with the reaction, right? So monasticism, we found people. Now remember, when it was the church became the mainstream, what was the reaction of monasticism? Let's go to the desert and be alone, right? We want to show how unique Christianity is by being alone. And then we had the Benedictine rule that said, well, if growing land is this, then we're going to start becoming our own self-sufficient. We're going to give everything away. So now we are greed and wealth management, wealth accumulation is the deal today. So we're going to say that that's wrong. Okay, that's the struggle with monasticism. It's always a reaction, but it's a reaction that God uses for good things. In this case, there arose the mendicant monks. Okay, mendicant. I don't know what the word is. Is it a noun? Mendicant. Basically, mendicant monks are those who favored poverty. Okay, that's just what the term means. So they wanted to give everything up. Now, how does that make them different than past versions of monasticism? Because remember, what happened when they went out to the desert? They gave everything up, right? What are these guys? What's the difference between these guys and the previous versions? These were
There's a lot more to give up?
no?
Benedictine monks work with their hands.
Good. What's the difference now?
Now, these monks beg rather than work.
Right. So remember the last ones, they would go out into the desert, but remember their goal? I want to be self-sufficient. I grow just enough for what I need, and that's all I have. These guys say, I don't want anything. I'm just going to sit on the side of the road and beg for people to give to me. So that's the difference now. Because now before it was, I want to be alone and ascetic. Now I want to be ascetic and poor. There's, for some reason, like I said, it's not necessarily right, but God uses this for some good purposes. So they embrace poverty, which is good, because even then they had the growing wealth gap. We make a big deal about it today. Then it was actually real. There's the rich, and then there was the poor, and that gap was really, really significant at this time. And the rich were literally getting richer because they could actually print their own money, to be honest. So these guys that were willing to come out, give up all they had, and come in and beg with the poor made them kind of favored by the poor. Yeah, those that favor begging. I couldn't quite figure out if it's a noun or not. So we're going to look at two guys. First, of Francis of Assisi, and then Dominic de Guzman. So Francis is interesting. He was born in 1182 in central Italy. His actual name is Giovanni, but he loved all things French, so they called him Francesco, the Frenchman, to which we shortened to Francis. Francesco sounds better. Francesco was actually very rich, and he lived in a very rich lifestyle. But he got sick. He has a series of visions. We've heard that before. He gave everything away and started beginning in the streets. A number of legends have arisen. In one, actually, he had a mystical vision of Jesus saying, Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? What are you going to do if you see that vision? Obviously, that means go fix the church. All right, I'm off and running. So his family actually tried to dissuade him away from this. Actually, this is interesting. They tried to lock him up in a basement. They beat him so he would come to his senses. Eventually, he renounced his inheritance. He actually renounces that I'm not even a part of this family. And then he left naked, because the clothes he was wearing were also given to him by his parents. And so he actually took those off, laid them on the ground, and left the room stark naked. And he went and lived in a hermit in the woods on the edge of the streets. Somehow, I guess, fully clothed. He was accepted into church, and he preached. He heard a gospel. He heard the story of the disciples. When the disciples were said, when Jesus sent out the disciples to preach in his name, Francis took that as a mission statement, and he realized that poverty was a means to preach and to serve the poor. So he returned to Assisi and began preaching. Okay? Now, what was wrong with that? Not a big deal in our day and age, because we're Protestants. What was that? Yeah, I think this time he's close, right? What's the problem? We're Protestants, so we maybe can't understand this. What's the problem with Francis returning and preaching? He's not a priest. Who's allowed to teach at this time? Just the priests. So he's teaching kind of... But he starts teaching about poverty. People start really liking him. He started calling his followers lesser or little brethren because he wanted them to be humble, to consider themselves less than everybody else, both in name and in thought. He didn't like learning. He felt that that just brought more conceit. So he forbade even owning a Bible. You were not allowed to own a Bible. You weren't allowed to preach it. So you could preach it, but you weren't allowed to learn from it. I don't know how those two things go together. That's my 20th century Protestant mentality. But eventually, though, Pope Innocent III approves of his movement. Now, he said that he was preaching and he was teaching about poverty. Innocent is on the verge of not approving it, but he's got such a vast following, and he's okay with the Pope, and Innocent has a vision that tells him that he should say it's okay. So Francis is given approval to set up a movement, and that legitimizes his teaching and his order, and people starts joining it. Now this is interesting. They traveled far. Like Francis went as far. He actually went to Egypt in 1219 to preach to the Muslims. After the Crusades, it was the Franciscan monks that were allowed to stay and care for the churches that were left in Jerusalem. They kicked out the Crusaders. They kicked out everyone else. But the Franciscan monks were specifically allowed by the Muslim leaders to stay and to care for the churches. So there was something there because their humility caught the eye of the Muslims. Another guy, a later monk, John of Monte Corvino, actually walked all the way from Persia to Ethiopia to India and eventually to Beijing. And many of them died as martyrs because people didn't like to hear the gospel. So they were serious guys. These guys were taking the gospel far and wide.
Just a little side, jump forward 500 years. Wasn't Benito Rosera, was he a Franciscan monk that established the missions in California?
I don't know.
He was Franciscan, yeah.
San Francisco?
Yeah, San Francisco, yeah.
I believe you.
But I mean, that gives it continues on.
Yep. Now, here's the problem. It wasn't just the poor that were realizing that the wealth was a problem. A lot of the wealthy people started realizing that was a problem. So they started renouncing their wealth and joining his movement. But these were intellectuals and teachers. So you tell a bunch of intellectuals and teachers that you shouldn't like to learn anymore, and you got a problem. So unfortunately for Francis, this is his worst fear, is that his movement is starting to get smart, and they're starting to get respected, and they're starting to get successful, and people are really liking them. And he didn't like that because it's hard to think lesser of yourself when everybody's telling you you're awesome. So as he's dying, he passes a rule that nobody in the Franciscan order is allowed to own possessions. And they, of course, wouldn't have any wealth. Further, they were never to appeal to the Pope that this rule would ever be changed. Then he died in 1226. Soon after he died, two groups formed. There was one group that were rigorists that said, no, he's right, we can't own anything, there's nothing we can do, we should never change it. The other ones were the moderates that said, well, wait a second, guys, we can do a lot if we just accept the gifts that people are giving us. I mean, we've got a chance to take the gospel far and wide if we just use the skills and the gifts that we've been given. So you have two groups, the moderates and the rigorists. The moderates then do what? Appeal to the Pope to change the rule. 1230, 4 years, just 4 years. 1230, Gregory IX declared Francis's rules non-binding, and that the monasteries could own property. Eventually, the monasteries actually own the property and become quite successful. San Francisco comes out of that a few hundred years later. The rigorists, however, continue to pull away from society. They consider themselves to be more spiritual than the rest. Yeah, pride. No pride. They're very humble, spiritual people. They started following the prophecies of Jehoiakim of Fiore. He posited that the year 1260 would see a new era in God's economy in which the spirituals would reign over the lesser nominal believers.
And there's no pride.
Yeah. Unfortunately, 1260 came and went. Nothing changed. The rigorists lost a lot of their credibility, and they eventually fell away, leaving just the moderates. And that's the Franciscans that we see now. We don't have time to go over everything, but let's just say Francis wrote a lot about the beauty of nature. He said that that was a reflection of God's character, so you can learn a lot from nature. Interesting stuff. He called the animals his brothers and sisters, and even preached to the birds, according to legend. He preached to the birds and didn't lose their attention even once, because they were amazed at his preaching. I'm not making this stuff up. That's what the legend says.
Is that why they bless animals at PetSmart?
I don't know. But here's a good story about Francis. There was a wolf that was threatening the town of Gubbio. Francis went to the woods. He found the wolf, who was exceedingly terrorizing, apparently. After giving him the sign of the cross, he commanded the wolf to come to him. And the wolf, as expected, came and sat at his feet. To which Francis is supposed to have said, "Brother wolf, you do much harm in these parts, and you have done great evil. All these people accuse you and curse you, but Brother wolf, I would like to make peace between you and the people." And then Francis led the wolf into town, surrounded by startled citizens, and made a pact with them and the wolf. And you can read the rest of the story in the notes if you want. In 1979, because of his willingness to engage in animals and his love of nature, John Paul II declared Francis the patron saint of ecology. I don't know why you need a patron saint of that, but you apparently do. In fact, the current pope, interestingly enough, is also very against consumerism. He has his thing is care for the poor, especially addressing the wealth gap, and he wants action on climate change. So therefore, his name is Pope Francis. That's where he got it from, because he wants to pattern his life after Francis of Assisi. Interesting. Dominic de Guzman. Dominic was born in the town of Castile in northern Spain to a wealthy aristocratic family. He eventually becomes a priest. They actually had hoped that he would... Nope, that's different. Never mind. While he's going through, he starts working with Diego I don't know. He's the Bishop of Osma. He encounters the Cathars. Now, the Cathars lived in southern France. They believed that there were two gods, one good, one evil. They believed that human nature is inherently evil, and that human spirits are trapped by human flesh, which is inherently evil, which is created by the God of the Old Testament, making the God of the Old Testament evil. Meanwhile, the New Testament God preaches about freedom from the flesh, willingness to get out of your spirit, freeing the spirit from the body. Therefore, the New Testament God is good. Where have we heard this before? Gnosticism. How many years ago? 1,000 years ago. Interesting. So, the Cathars are essentially Gnosticism reborn. Now, have we already dealt with this topic before in the church? Yes. Ignatius and others fought against this heresy years and years ago, and it's still back up. So, here we are again, 1,000 years later. Dominic de Guzman's walking through, and he says, "Wait a second, that's heresy. We've already talked about this before." These Cathars were interesting, though. The church eventually sought to convert these guys through missions. Eventually, they abandoned the missions, and they just proclaimed crusades. If you're not going to convert, then you're going to die. So they started hunting these people down. Dominic's walking through, he realizes, well, hold on, these Cathars are not ignorant, uneducated fanatics. They're actually quite smart, and they're well trained. They're missing it. And one of the things I really like about their people is their leaders are very ascetic. They're very pure, and they seek purity, which is exactly what the church wanted, right? And that's what you can see all over, is their poorness and their purity. So the Cathars were completely turned off from the church because of all the wealth. So Dominic starts thinking about how he's going to preach to the Cathars. So he starts creating a set of documents on how to preach to the Cathars. In the process, he adopts a ascetic, monastic approach to things. So you have the Dominican monks arrive, who are actually quite interesting. These guys actually value education, because they were formed from Dominic, whose goal was to try to preach to the Cathars and try to refute their heresy to try to win them back by the gospel. So he actually starts bringing in people where in his order, you are actually trained and taught. We want you to understand. We want you to be educated because you have to preach the gospel. You have to refute heresy. So this group, unlike Francis, actually valued education. They still wanted to be poor because the poverty was what established their gospel. They wanted to be poor so that they could walk into places and people wouldn't say, oh, you're just wealthy just like the church. They wanted to throw that off and say, we have nothing, I'm just coming here to preach. But then they were actually educated enough to preach the right things. So Dominican monks, they start opening schools. They have they actually have a number of leading theologians come out of their movement because they were just such good theologians. Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about in a second, was one of them. They were actually much more able to deal with the success than the Franciscans without changing everything that they believed in. They were also allowed to own property and wealth, so their monasteries became quite large and quite wealthy. The Inquisition. Dominic may have played a part in starting the Inquisition, because when you start preaching against heresy, people start taking that message and they start running to the extremes. History is reaction. So therefore, if heresy is bad, anyone that's a heretic is bad, therefore I have license to kill them, so I have an Inquisition. Was Dominic part of the Inquisition? Probably not. Did he contribute to the Inquisition movement? Probably. He's also the patron saint of astronomers. I have no idea why. I couldn't find anything about that. But he is. Okay, enough on monasticism. Questions? Those are the good ones. Let's talk about Innocent III, because we want to talk about messes. Innocent III was possibly the most powerful pope ever in terms of his influence. We talked a lot about the Pope last time I talked. Now we're going to talk about him again. Innocent III, his original name was Lotario di Conti di Segni. He was born in central Italy, not far from Rome, a very powerful family. In fact, this family actually saw 9 popes come from their ranks. He studied in Paris, Rome, and Bologna, and by 1190 reached the position of cardinal deacon. We know about the Pope's power. We've already talked about that at length at this point. Just prior to Innocent, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire was seeking to gain control. He marries the Princess of Sicily, making him have Germany up here, Sicily down here, and Italy right in the middle. He moves in on Rome because he's actually going to militarily take the city. Obviously, the Pope isn't really thrilled with that idea, so they're fighting back. Both of them die at the same time. That's the story. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is trying to figure out what to do. Rome immediately comes up and they decide to elect Lotario, who takes the name Innocent III. Okay. This is where Innocent gets interesting. He saw it was his duty and right to intervene in any affairs of state. Okay? Where does this come from? Let's talk about he's not just pulling stuff out of the air. He's actually thinking, he's actually got a reason for this, and he writes at length about it. He compares the power of the kings and the Pope to that of the sun and the moon. Okay? What's the difference between the sun and the moon? One gives light, one reflects it. So which one do you think is which in Innocent's metaphor? The Pope is the sun, and the kings are the moon. So therefore, right? He has the right, and as we'll see, he has the obligation to actually decide what is right and wrong. He writes, just as the founder of the universe established 2 great lights in the firmament of heaven, the greater light to rule the day, lesser light to rule the night. Remember, that's from Genesis. You can't argue with that, right? So, too, he has 2 great dignities in the firmament of the universal church. The greater to rule the day is the souls, the lesser is to rule the bodies, right? So the one who rules over the souls of the people is greater than the one who just rules over their bodies, which would really be the same thing as what the Catholics were teaching, and the fact that there's a good and evil, is a difference between the soul and the body. We won't go there. In his mind, Innocent spared no time in involving himself in the affairs of state. In Germany, we're not going to go over everything because we don't have time. Let's just say he decides he doesn't like Frederick, because remember, Frederick was the one marching on Rome. So Philip, Frederick's brother, is the one that's elected next emperor. Innocent says, wait, I'm going to go for the rival candidate, Otto, because I don't like Philip. I don't want his house to rule over the empire anymore. So that throws the Holy Roman Empire into civil war for the next 10 years because the Pope keeps supporting Otto and keeps giving him money and everything else, so Otto can keep fighting against Philip. The Pope is causing a 10-year civil war by his support in a strictly secular affair. It has nothing to do with the church, but he's involved. Also, what right does he have to... anyways, okay. Let's just say he decided that when Frederick Barbarossa started coming in on Rome, what did the Pope, at that time it was Celestine, what did the Pope do? What do you think the Pope did? He excommunicated him. Well, the excommunication then flows over to Philip, so therefore Philip now has no right to the throne. So therefore Otto is the rightful ruler, right? Because Pope has said, you're deposed because you're excommunicated, you have no right to the throne, this guy's the legitimate emperor. So, and by saying that, the problem with that is Philip was actually duly elected by the nobles as the rightful ruler of the empire. So what has Innocent just done? I don't care what your rules are. Here's what I think should be right. So, wait, but that's the rule of the land. That's the proper way of doing things. That's what our Constitution says. I don't care. I'm the son. I can tell you what's right and wrong, even if the rules, I can disobey laws because I know what's right and wrong. Gosh, what could possibly go wrong with that, right? There's a quote here. You can see what he thought about that. He says, it's his right to look after the interests of the Roman people, so therefore he can disobey laws to be able to that end. Let's see, so he supports Otto. Now, interestingly, at the end of the 10-year war, Philip is murdered, leaving Otto as the sole ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, which includes northern Italy. So Otto comes in and starts pushing his rule onto northern Italy. Guess who owned a ton of land in northern Italy? The Pope. So now who's at odds with Otto? The Pope. So what does the Pope do? He goes and finds Frederick Barbossa's son and says, no, this guy is the son of the emperor. He's the legitimate ruler of the throne. So what has he just done? He just put Frederick's family back on the throne. All the way around, man. This guy is something else. So he puts Frederick back on the throne after deposing him and declaring his father an excommunicant. Okay. In France, King Philip Augustus, he was widowed. He remarries, divorces his wife, and then remarries a third. Innocent, because he's now apparently the ruler of what is moral and not moral, tells King Philip to go back to his second wife. Why? Because it's innocent and he feels like it's important. So what does he do? He closes the church in France. The only thing that the French priests are allowed to do are baptisms and the last rites. So what does that cause a problem with? Okay, well that's kind of vague. What does that cause a problem with?
They can't marry before deliver the sacraments, so...
The sacraments. What happens if I can't take the sacraments on a regular basis? What have I convinced the people of by this time? There's no hope for me. I have to have the sacraments. If I don't take the sacraments, if I don't do confession, we're in huge trouble. I have to have the church open. So people start moving against King Philip. So Philip has no choice but to return to his second wife and admit the Pope is right. So he returns to his second wife. The third wife, according to legend, the third wife dies shortly thereafter from intense depression, and the second wife spends the rest of her life complaining that her renewed marriage was a constant torture. Innocent fixed everything. In England, John Lackland comes to power, and you can correct me on this if I'm missing something. John Lackland comes to power His infidelity is no worse than Philip's, but this is when what's his name? Innocent is trying to help Otto, so he's okay with John Lackland's infidelity because I need his support for the time being. So we'll overlook that. But you, Philip, you got a problem. He later, there's two claimants to the position of Archbishop in Canterbury. Innocent says, well, what is the proper rule of the land? That is what I shall follow to decide who should be bishop. Okay, that's not what he did. What do you think he did? I reject both of those guys. Here's the guy I want. But aren't they supposed to be elected? Yeah, they're elected. Everybody votes for mine. Here it is. So he puts a guy named Stephen Langton. John Lackland refuses to accept Stephen Langton. So Innocent, fill in the word, excommunicates him. Unfortunately, that didn't stop John. Innocent calls for a crusade in England to depose John forcefully. That causes John to freak out because Philip joined him. Because remember, France, England, they hate each other. They always hate each other. So Philip was going to join the Pope to invade England because that's perfect. John decides this is all right. The Pope's right. We can have this guy. Unfortunately, Stephen Langton, then John is not a happy camper. He's a very unpopular ruler. So Stephen Langton goes and actually drafts a document that limits the power of the king in relation to the nobles. Do you know what that document was called? The Magna Carta. That was written by Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton was appointed by Innocent. Innocent says, wait a second, that's not right. The king is what? The moon. I mean, compared to me, you're nothing. But over your people, you're everything. This document limits your power over everybody else. That's wrong. So now Innocent actually becomes John Lackland's supporter and actually condemns Stephen Langton, who he appointed, his document against limiting the power of the king. Innocent actually becomes supporting John Lackland. He declares the document annulled. It has no power. And that didn't do very well. As we've seen, England kind of says, thanks for your input. And then they just continue on that path. The Magna Carta gets drafted a few more times, but it actually becomes kind of, I'm not going to go too far on this, but basically that it becomes, to a degree, the foundation for the parliamentary structure that rises on top of it, and that we can appreciate a lot from our culture and here in the United States. Innocent was not a good name. All right. Innocent also called for the Fourth and Fifth Crusades. He's most known for, he's known for a lot of things. He's also known for calling the Fourth Lateran Council. The Fourth Lateran Council is huge in terms of Protestantism for the simple reason that it defines most of what Catholicism becomes as we know it today. It certainly becomes exactly what Catholicism becomes during the Reformation. So understanding what happened in the Fourth Lateran Council will help you understand a lot of what Martin Luther was fighting against. During this time, the Fourth Lateran Council proclaimed the papal primacy by divine will, and that Rome is first in terms of the most important bishop, followed by Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. At this time, of those other ones, who mattered? Barely. Constantinople was about to fall to the Muslims. So of this list, who's the only one standing? Amazing how that works, isn't it? By the way, these doctrines, this council had over 1,000 people, and it was concluded in a matter of days. So either everybody agreed on everything amazingly, or... What did you say, Innocent? I agree. I agree with that guy. What he said. So, Rome is first. The doctrine of transubstantiation becomes official in this case. Okay, the body and the blood. And we talked about that. That was 200 years ago when it started. It is now official church doctrine. 400 years ago. Now it's official church doctrine. Okay? And we talked about the guy last week, or a couple weeks ago, who tried to refute that and was labeled a heretic. He condemned the Waldensians. We'll talk about Peter Waldo in a second. The Cathars and the doctrines of Jehoiakim of Fiore. Well, like that's hard to do. He established the Episcopal Inquisition. So the whole thing where he said, let's go after heretics, in a sense, started it. No new monastic orders were allowed, except the Franciscans, because I had a vision. He required establishments of schools and cathedrals that education be available to the poor. Remember the whole thing about celibate and non-celibate priests and everything? Becomes official. You're not allowed to do it here. Decreed that the faithful must confess their sins to a priest and receive communion at least once a year. Forbade the introduction of new relics without the Pope's approval. Remember the whole Crusades? Everybody was finding spears and pieces of the cross. Can't do it anymore. They required Jews and Muslims living in Christian lands to wear distinctive garments that would set them apart from Christians. That was actually to protect them from persecution. I don't know. And it also made it unlawful for priests to charge for the administration of the sacraments. I thought that was funny.
The Jews had to wear different things in Germany.
They've had to a number of times. Yeah. The Jews have struggled throughout the years. The Pope started becoming supernatural because of the power that he was given. He died in 1216 while preparing for the Fifth Crusade. A couple popes later, we get Boniface VIII, who issues the term, one sword must be under the other. The temporal authority must be subject to the spiritual. Okay, this is important. Therefore, if earthly power strays from the right path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. If the earthly power strays from the path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. But if the supreme spiritual authority strays, it can only be judged by God and not by humans. We further declare, affirm, and define that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of all human creatures to be under the Roman pontiff. Well, what is wrong with that statement?
No one else is saved unless you're Catholic Church.
You can't be saved outside of the Catholic Church. And if the Catholic Church, the head of the Catholic Church goes astray, who can stop him?
No one, only God.
Only God. I have no leanings. I don't have to listen to the earthly authorities because I am over them. The only one that tells me that I'm wrong is God. No earthly authority can say that I'm wrong. What leads to that? That leads to papal infallibility. It also establishes why the Germans hated the Pope. Okay? More on that as we continue through the Reformation.
When did the doctrines of Mary get introduced?
They're throughout this. They don't become established until 1800s.
But they're developing during this entire time.
Yeah. They're developing in this time. They don't actually become official until the 1800s, I think, along with papal infallibility, which all of a sudden gets discovered in 1600, about the time that they're refuting Martin Luther. All of a sudden the Pope becomes infallible. But you see where it's coming from right here in the 1300s. Peter Waldo. Don't know much about him. He was a merchant in France. He gives up his possessions, and he starts reading his Bible, reading the Bible. He actually starts translating it from Latin into French. What was wrong with that? That's why it was good. What was wrong with it?
Against the law to do anything besides Latin.
It's against the law. Why was that passed originally? Because remember Marcion? What was Marcion doing? Marcion was editing the Bible to his own need. And so the church said, no, only the church is allowed to read and interpret the Bible. So when the church said Latin is the official Bible language, they kind of took those arguments that said you can't edit out the Bible to your own purpose, and now said you can't edit the Bible, period. And so now no other translation was allowed except Latin, not French. So Peter Waldo already has problems. Then he starts preaching about this against the special place of the church's clergy and insisting on the universal priesthood of all believers. What is this guy thinking? He even starts talking against papal excesses, and he rallied against purgatory and transubstantiation. That's not biblical. And then he kind of pushes over the top a little bit, and he compares the Pope to the harlot spoken of in the book of Revelation.
And there are people who are still doing that.
I know. But this was in 1200. So does this guy sound remotely like Martin Luther? 300 years before Martin Luther. He's called to Rome to explain his doctrines. He wasn't well received. So the Third Lateran Council condemned his movement, and his followers were forced to leave to Lyon. The Pope excommunicated Peter and his followers. They became known as the Waldensians. And then they moved and were persecuted throughout the next 300 years. They go to the Alps. Who do they find in the Alps 300 years later? John Calvin. These guys merged into the Genevan Church. Genevan Church, led by John Calvin. All right, Anselm, you're going to like him. He was in northern Italy, became a Benedictine monk. He frequently visited England and gained the respect of one William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror appointed Anselm Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Anselm, though, he really liked the idea of the investiture conflict. We talked about that before. Who's allowed to determine who the priests are? Well, the emperor wants the priests to be certain people because they own lots of land, and he wanted that power. He's afraid of rebellion. While the Pope said no, only the priests can only be appointed by the church, and so they go back and forth. Anselm supported the Pope on that. Now, here's why Anselm was kind of cool. He writes a number of, he's big into theology. He writes what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. Okay? He says, I do not seek to understand that I may believe. I believe that I may understand. For this I also believe that unless I believe, I will not understand. In other words, you cannot reason yourself into believing in God. So his argument is God is by definition greater than anything we can conceive of. Okay, and we're going to skip through. You can read the arguments in the paper. But basically, he argues that God is greater than what we can conceive of. So by implication, the human mind cannot reason itself to a knowledge of God. You have to have God expressed in revelation to understand him. You cannot reason your way to God. This is called the ontological. It's given. God exists, therefore things are, as opposed to, therefore things are, what can I learn about God? Okay? His arguments are still in play today. A number of apologetics will still reference Anselm's argument from 1,000 years ago. He also discusses why God became man. Now, the prevailing opinion on this, the church teaching, comes from Origen and Gregory of Nyssa. We talked about those guys. Those guys were from the 250s and the 300s. Okay, so for 700 years, the prevailing opinion of the church, and because it's the prevailing opinion of the church, and it's written by church fathers who are apparently really important, makes it church doctrine. The prevailing opinion is that the devil held power, and all souls are, what do we say? The devil has rights to all fallen humanity. So therefore, what Christ did was paid the ransom that the devil placed on the head of all humans, and Christ came and he paid that. And who do you pay a ransom to? Satan. So he paid the ransom to Satan to free humanity. Okay? It's called the ransom theory. So why is that a problem? Well, what is sin? Huh? What is sin according to the ransom theory? It's a debt owed to Satan. It's what places you under Satan's rule. It's what makes Satan have power over you. That's all sin is. Okay? Anselm starts reading his Bible and saying, yeah, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. It seems to me that sin is actually a crime against God, not against Satan. And that because God is infinite, any sin is an infinite crime. And therefore, if it's an infinite crime, it requires an infinite payment. So therefore, Christ had to come, and he had to become man so he could take our place, and he had to be God so that he could pay that infinite price that no mere mortal could possibly pay. And by that, we get our substitutionary atonement doctrine. Does that sound familiar? It should be. For 700 years, it wasn't. Okay, for 700 years, it's been this whole ransom theory. Anselm comes along and says, I don't think that's accurate. So guess what? He was not excommunicated. He was not excommunicated. However, he did take a number of criticisms. The church did not accept his opinions. Even other guys were like, no, that's kind of cruel. I mean, even guys that disagree with the church doctrine said, that's cruel. Christ died for what? No, other guys like Peter Abelard, who's an interesting guy, says, no, the cross is God's instruction, that it shows his love, and that causes people to change and become more loving, and so then they embrace the gospel. So even at the time, Anselm could not convince people into this. And his arguments become the foundation of Calvin's work and others in the Reformation, and they expand on it into what we have today. So Anselm started this guy. Thomas Aquinas. Have you heard of this guy before? Thomas Aquinas? His book that he wrote, his most significant book, was the Summa Theologica. It's considered the second most important book behind the Bible in the Catholic Church. That kind of tells you a little bit about what they think about him. He establishes a number of Catholic doctrines as we've seen them. Now, we talked about this, and this is why I brought it up before. Greek philosophy finds itself in Spain, and then they start spreading across Europe. A part of that was Aristotle's philosophy. Do you remember the difference? I wouldn't either, but do you remember the difference between Aristotle and Plato? Platonic thought versus Aristotle's? Plato was kind of like, here's the idea, what does that mean? Aristotle said, here's what I can observe, what does that mean? Okay? Inductive versus deductive. Aristotle said, I can start with what I observe, and I'm going to make reasonable conclusions about that are going to tell me about what I can't see. Whereas Plato said, I'm going to start with what I can't see, and I'm going to start talking about the implications of what that means on society. Okay? The Bible's a mixture of both. You can get, there's pieces of it that you can find. Aquinas, however, adopted the Aristotelian method. What I can see teaches me about what I know about God. Okay? So he starts going through this whole thing. He has what are called the 5 ways, okay, to answer the question of whether God exists. He goes through the kind of the unmoved mover. Everything's in motion. Everything can't start in motion. Therefore, there had to be somebody that started it in motion. There has to be a cause. Everything's a cause and effect. Well, what was the original cause? He starts going into contingency, degree, design. They're all basically the same kind of things, that we see a design, there had to be an original designer. A lot of things that we actually use today in our apologetics. So Aquinas has really helped establish a lot of that. Now this only proves that there was the existence of a God, not necessarily the God. So he did get to the point where he agreed with Anselm that there's only so much you can learn from observation. What you have to have is the Bible itself. The Bible's specific revelation tells you about the Trinitarian God. These arguments just tell you about a God and leave us all responsible. Okay? Now, Thomas, his problem, if you will, was he accepted the Bible, which he was good at, and church tradition. And so he accepted church tradition, which allowed him to really kind of change his theology to match church tradition more often than not. That's why the Catholics love him, of course. He also kind of came up with some things like, we cannot consider God in his infinity. We can only talk about him by analogy or by negation. And that's generally true today. If I say that God is eternal, what does that mean? Is that he had no beginning and he had no end. All I can say is what he's not. I can't tell you what he is because I have no concept of that. That's negation. Or God is wise. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of like Solomon, but more. So by analogy. Okay, so he starts going through a lot of that and establishes that as a theological approach to things to kind of get that in motion. Something that helps train others, and during the Reformation, that kind of teaching becomes important. He also said that man is a free moral agent, that God loves all men, but left to man to respond to the offer of his grace. Original sin is a moral corruption, but not a completely deadening concept. Therefore, while corrupt, we can still respond to and cooperate with God's grace. That's the problem. He agreed with Anselm's view of substitutionary atonement. However, he tends to focus on the church as the intermediary of that grace. So he said Christ paid to God the cost to satisfy his wrath. But the only way to get to that payment is through the church. through the sacraments. Sacraments were an extension of Christ's humanity displayed in the incarnation. So it all kind of flows together. Christ paid this wrath. Christ was human. His human vessel here on earth is the church. The head of the church is the Pope. So therefore, you have to believe in the Pope. You have to come to church. You have to do what the church tells you. You have to take the sacraments if you want to participate in this grace that Christ paid to God. So substitutionary atonement is beautiful, and it can still be corrupted. Okay? He didn't originate, but he formulated the doctrine of transubstantiation, officially. Baptism cleanses the person from original sins and places them into the body of Christ. What could go wrong with that? Penance is a sacrament that removes guilt after sin. No problem with that. Indulgences were effective in relieving the consequences of sin. What could possibly go wrong with that? There exists some sort of treasury of merit that was initially filled by Christ and has been extended by the saints, the merits of saints that lived extraordinary lives of faith. This is what you can then, when you die, you keep praying for your brothers and sisters in purgatory, and that money, payment gets pulled out and attended to them even though they didn't believe in this life. It's complex. That concept goes back to the 2nd century, so that's not new. He's recognizing it. Rome is the head of the earthly church, and thus all churches should obey her. The Pope is the head of the Christ church, and has a responsibility to God's people in dispensing Christ's grace. Therefore, all people have a responsibility to obey the Pope. This is the foundation of papal infallibility in a few hundred years. He viewed 4 specific cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, as well as faith, hope, and charity. He also had 7 deadly sins: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, anger, envy, and pride. He recognized those. He's the one who first one who said, here's our 7 deadly sins. And so he's the one, that's where it all comes from. Okay. His arguments are still in place today. If you're a Catholic priest, you're going to go through this document head to toe, and you're going to memorize it. This is your belief system. His arguments for natural revelation were adopted by John Calvin. John Calvin goes further to say, here's how it really works. Yes, you can observe God, but you're so dead in your sins, according to the other chapters, Thomas, that you're not reading, that you'll never be able to get to a right view of God through natural revelation. So John Calvin takes Thomas Aquinas' work and expands on it to help with what we have today, what we're used to. That is 200 years of history in 45 minutes.
What about this Peter?
In an hour. So we've kind of sped through that. But you can see that there's some things that are happening. I mean, a lot of things that are happening. God is so working through this. We've seen the Crusades. We've seen political and economic shifts. We've seen the church come up with so many different weird stuff and good stuff. And now we started reading about Peter Waldo and his doctrines, and Anselm and his doctrines, and Thomas Aquinas and his doctrines. So things are still moving. It doesn't feel like it. We talk about the Pope, and the Pope is sort of a depressing point in our stuff. But from our Protestant worldview, this is really interesting stuff. There are things that are happening now that establish the Reformation, that establish our belief structure today, and they're just continuing to grow. So God is not at odds. He's not wondering. He's not scared. He's just bringing things to pass slowly. Okay? He's just on his own speed. The wheel's going to keep turning. He's going to grind until the grain is the right size, and then he's going to move to the next phase. So he's just continually moving. Okay? During the process, we see some depressing things, and we see some really encouraging things. Hopefully, guys like Peter Waldo, the fact that Anselm actually has some biblical knowledge, the fact that Aquinas, even though it's not all great, at least there's some Bible reading going on, it's still happening. It's still happening. People are coming around. People are listening. Things are growing. Okay? Pretty soon we're going to have something called the printing press, and then things all change.